Hi, my name is Kinga Kozminska, and I'm a lecturer in sociolinguistics at the Faculty of Linguistics, Philology and Phonetics at the University of Oxford. And in this 45-minute talk, together with Dr. Emily Lindsay-Smith, from whom you're going to hear more in the second part of the talk, we will try to introduce you to linguistics. And we'll first show you how linguistics is taught at Oxford, and then we'll share some interesting questions that linguists may ask with you, and we'll show you some puzzles that we often think about in linguistics. So we're going to start with what linguistics is and how it is actually taught at Oxford. So at Oxford, you cannot study linguistics on its own. If you decide to study linguistics after this presentation, you will have to pick between two options that you may have, which is you can study linguistics with modern languages. So any of the languages offered in the modern languages department could be studied in conjunction with linguistics. So you could take French, German, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, Russian, and modern Greek, and study any of these languages in conjunction with linguistics as part of your degree. If you decide to take that option, you will be enrolling into a 4-year long course, and you will have 1 year abroad. The other option of studying linguistics at Oxford is to pick the psychology, philosophy and linguistics degree, which is a 3-year course where you can decide to combine your interest in the study of language with psychology or with philosophy. So when you decide to apply for linguistics, you have to just bear in mind that you will have to study it in conjunction with other parts of your degree. When you will be deciding to study linguistics, whether to study linguistics, you will be making choices, and therefore it is quite good to think about linguistics and what it actually is at the very beginning. So in the next few minutes, I will try to introduce you to the very basic questions that linguists might be asking so that you can understand what linguists do and why they ask questions the way they do. So many linguists will be interested in understanding the ways in which we communicate and speak with one another, and what goes on when we do so, how it is possible for us to actually send messages and receive messages from others. But many linguists may be also interested in understanding how that ability to communicate with others develops in your lifetime. Many will be therefore interested in children and how children learn languages, and what happens when they communicate at different stages in their lives. So that could be also one of the areas of interest for many linguists actually. Many linguists will be also interested in asking questions about the role of language in society, and will be interested in understanding how language is used in literature, in the media, and by various members of society as well. So then they will be looking at these questions surrounding the ways in which we communicate with others and what goes on when we do so, but they will be also taking into account who is speaking to whom and why the conversation flows the way it does. So here you have a range of questions, all of them quite popular in linguistics, but linguists may be also asking other questions. They might be interested in the ways in which generate language. So they might be actually interested in, what goes on in your brain when you actually produce language and how you receive messages, how languages are mentally represented in your brain as well. And so many of the linguists might be interested in looking at the relationship between brain waves and language, what happens when we actually produce language. Many of us will be interested in the linguistic diversity, because if you start digging deeper into linguistics, you will see that actually there are many what we conventionally call languages, And linguists today agree that this number is above 7,000 languages in the world. So many scholars in linguistics will be interested in studying the structures and histories of those different languages. They may be comparing them in order to understand what all of us share and what is socioculturally specific in particular areas. So linguistics could be best defined as the study of language in all its aspects, really. So you can see that within that a field, there might be a range of questions related to language being asked, and therefore that may involve different tools of analysis and different types of data that linguists will be working with. What that short introduction showed you is that the linguists will be looking at, will be differentiating between language and languages, and they will be actually interested in both. So it is important to make sure that you understand what the difference between these two concepts is. And language in linguistics is usually defined as this human ability to acquire and use complex systems of communication. And a language or languages would be specific examples of such systems. And therefore, linguists will be actually interested in both, because we all share this human ability to acquire and use complex systems of communication, but there might be very interesting differences and similarities between those specific codes that we use when we converse with others. And in linguistics, we will be uncovering this profound knowledge that most speakers are unaware of when they communicate with others. Because when you start looking at what happens when we communicate with others, you will see that there is a lot of a complex knowledge being involved, and a lot of creativity. So we, on the one hand, for instance, when I'm speaking to you, I'm producing many sounds, and you are able to understand what I'm saying because of the fact that we share a code, and you know what these different sort of combinations of words and sentences that I'm sending to you actually mean. So you can see that this involves this profound knowledge, but it's actually very creative, because I keep producing and putting different elements together in order to convey some complex stretches of discourse, some complex meaning to you. So in linguistics, we've developed different subfields that deal with different sort of levels of language structure and use that are quite important for understanding of what actually happens when you communicate with others. And therefore, when you decide to come to us, you will be introduced to those different subfields of linguistics that will have mysterious names, but that you will quickly learn more about in order to understand how language is produced and understood. We'll be introduced to phonetics and phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics and pragmatics, for example, and then also to discourse analyses. So all these names sound quite mysterious, but they actually deal with different levels of linguistic structure and use and help us understand how we make meaning. So for instance, phonetics and phonology will be this branch of linguistics that you will be introduced in your first year, for example, and that will allow you to understand how we produce speech, what happens in your vocal tract, in your, you know, and your mouth when you're producing different sounds, and how you then combine these sounds in order to produce meaningful utterances. You will be also introduced to morphology, which will be about words, because as you can see, first we produce some sounds, but these sounds sort of pattern to create larger units, and these larger units that carry meaning, and are the smallest ones that carry meaning, will be those that morphologists will be dealing with. So words, and you will be learning more about how words are formed. Obviously, when we communicate, we rarely confine ourselves to individual sounds or words, and therefore you will be also introduced to syntax, which in common usage could be similar to grammar, because that will allow you to understand how we put words into phrases and sentences, but which will be slightly different from what you can find in a textbook for English grammar, for example, because in linguistics in general, we won't be really interested in the rules that people tell you are appropriate, but we will be looking at how people actually use language and what rules govern less standardized ways of putting words together too. And syntax will allow you to understand how sentences are produced. Semantics and pragmatics will allow you to better understand the meaning behind words and how words enter relations with other words, let's say in English, how it is that you have words that mean more or less the same, but not yet the same. So you will also be introduced to pragmatics, which will allow you to see that there are some words in languages that will only be understood if you know the context. So for instance, if I say, I'm here, you only know that I referred to me because I said it to you now. But this is a deictic expression, as we call it in linguistics, that only acquires meaning because of the context as well. So semantics and pragmatics will allow you to better understand the meaning relations between words. And finally, we produce also longer stretches of discourse and longer stretches of speech, text, and here discourse analysis and other subfields will allow you to understand how we actually produce those longer messages as well. And all those subfields of linguistics will give you a very thorough introduction into meaning-making processes and into a very good knowledge of linguistic structure and use. You might be able to know many of the rules that you might discover in linguistics, but you might not be yet fully aware of them. To give you an example, all of us rely on phonological knowledge all the time, and when we actually produce meaning, because we know how to produce sequences of sounds that are meaningful in the languages that we speak. But we might not necessarily be yet able to describe these rules. So linguistics will give you tools to understand how these sounds are produced and how they are then put together, what is allowed in a particular language and what is possible but doesn't exist and what is not allowed. So here you have some examples of sequences of sounds that are meaningful in English, for instance, as pen and pin. You know that they differ only in one sound and carry different meanings. So they are what we would call minimal pairs in linguistics. But you also know, based on your knowledge of English, that pon is a possible combination of sounds in English, but it is not really a word in British English, at least. So you can see that some combinations of sounds will be possible, but they won't be meaningful. And yet there will be also those combinations that you will immediately, as a speaker of English, dismiss as being meaningful in English. So if I pronounce the word brzmi, as you can see in my third point here, you will see that in English that probably you immediately know it's meaningful, but as a speaker of Polish, I know it actually is a meaningful combination. It means it sounds in Polish. So in linguistics, we'll study these relationships between sounds and concepts and meanings in order to understand the rules and the relationship between sounds and meanings in more depth. You will, in the very first year when you come to us, you will see that you will learn that this relationship is largely arbitrary, but languages will differ in how they are going to make use of this relationship, actually. You will also learn that most of us grow up multilingually. So most of us in the world, and here we're talking about a global scale, most of us are actually able to converse and communicate with others in more than one way of speaking or communicating, or in more, and actually at a global scale, more actually labeled language. So for instance, English and Swahili would be one option, English and Urdu would be another option, for instance. And it could be more than two, of course. That's why it's called multilingual. And in linguistics, we will often argue that this is a huge advantage to be able to speak other languages, because if you understand and speak other languages, dialects, styles, you actually give yourself a lot of power and a lot of ways to connect with others. And we will be looking at the factors that may contribute to the different ways in which you will be developing your linguistic repertoires, when you will be using particular linguistic resources, for what purpose, with whom, and so on. So many of us will be interested in multilingual talk, and this is something that I study, for instance, and I will be very much interested in the dynamics of multilingual talk at various levels, and particularly in a phenomenon that we call in linguistics code switching, which is this juxtaposition of passages of speech that belong to different grammatical systems, and which is a perfectly normal in everyday language use in multilingual communities, and which has been observed to look both like the first and second examples that I have for you. So the first one, both of them come from original research projects, and the first one is an example of an intra-sentential code switch. So a code switch within a sentence, and here you can probably recognize the first half of the sentence where you can see, "Go and get my coat." And then you see "Aus dem Schrank da," which is from German. And this is a perfectly typical example of intrasentential code switching. But you can also have code switching between sentences, as in the second example from a study on Hungarian German bilingual speakers. And the text in green is in a dialect of German. And you can see that it is a case of intersentential code switching, so between sentences. And in linguistics, we will be very much interested in understanding why people switch and how they switch, and how we could best understand this. So we would be interested in seeing whether differences in language structure between the codes involved contributes to the possibilities for the code switch. But we will also be interested in understanding how code switching serves as one of the strategies that helps us to provide speakers with contextual information about how to interpret a communicative event. And we will be also looking at social functions of code switching. So code switching has been shown to be used to achieve multiple interactional goals. Many people have and studied have shown that it allows speakers to express feelings, to show involvement with topics, to express politeness or respect, but also to project different identities. So we will be learning a lot about how society works as well, and how different communities go about their linguistic resources, from studies and recordings of multilingual talk that we collect in our research projects in multiple corners in the world, actually. The phenomenon of code switching is fascinating for linguists, for instance, because it is not a uniform phenomenon, and there are multiple linguistic and societal factors that we will have to take into account to better understand why it happens. People have developed very complex linguistic repertoires on their own, But the different styles and dialects or different languages that they have at their disposal may also differ. And they might, we might also be interested in variation between the different codes that you might have access to as a speaker. So many scholars in sociolinguistics, which is the field that I work in, will be looking at, the differences between speakers in terms of pronunciation, grammatical constructions, lexical choices, and why it is that some speakers pronounce certain consonants or vowels when they speak English or any other language, and why some other people don't. So to give you an example from a project that was conducted at Cambridge, you can see that, a typical sort of differentiation in English in the British Isles has to do with the presence or absence of R's. And you can see here the example of the map of the UK and how the R's are distributed across the UK. The green territory is the territory of the dialects where people don't pronounce the R's, as in arms, for instance. But in Scotland or Ireland, you can see that people will be pronouncing the R's. So many people in linguistics will be looking at maps and distribution of different forms. And they will be also looking at some other factors than geographical location only, because they will probably quickly see that this is just a visual representation in particular time and place, and that in order to understand how people use variation, we have to take into account other factors such as your networks, whether, for instance, people in your network know one another, like in the figure that you can see on the right-hand side here, or whether your networks are very uniplex and low in density. So that means that people in your network won't be, won't know each other. And studies have shown that that type of network actually increases chances for linguistic innovation. So people will be looking at networks. They will also look at age, gender, ethnicity, and other categories that have an impact on the embodied experience of many, but also at situational factors and the audiences that you will be talking to. And in order to understand the dynamics of the use of different codes and variation within codes, many of us will be working with recordings of daily interactions, and will be looking at the minute detail of speech in order to inform understanding of big questions in linguistics to do with the ways in which language changes. So now I will give the floor to Emily, who will tell you more about language change.
Hi, my name is Emily Lindsay-Smith, and I'm one of our outreach officers at the Faculty of Linguistics, Philology and Phonetics at Oxford. I've recently finished my PhD looking at Arabic sound structure, and today I'm going to talk to you a bit more about language variation and change. So all languages change, and all parts of the grammar can and do change. And what we're interested in as linguists is how and why this change can happen. Some people do object to language change and they want to protect what they perceive as pure and correct language. So, for example, in 1975, France passed a law to prevent the use of borrowed words in advertising. So you can't say le club, le bar, le hit parade, le weekend, les hot dog in French adverts, but yet these words do persist in French. So these laws to try and stop language change just don't really work. So languages change, and they change inexorably, and they change due to a variety of reasons. So there can be external social pressures. The needs of the speaker can change with new technologies, new products, new experiences, and different people can have different language experiences. And there can also be internal reasons, so natural linguistic processes like child language acquisition, speaker errors, a preference for regular systems, and competing pressures. Words can persist over time. When we're looking at how languages change, we can see that some languages evolve from older languages. So we can see words sort of persist from Latin through to English today. So the word hospital comes from the Latin hospitalis, meaning hospitable, then which becomes the medieval Latin hospitale, for shelter, the Old French hospitale for hospice, and the Middle English hospital for hospital. But during the Middle Ages, hospitals served different functions from modern institutions. Middle Ages hospitals were almshouses for the poor, hostels for pilgrims, or hospital schools. So the word hospital has come from our Latin hospitalis, meaning hospitable, which is derived from the Latin hospes, signifying a stranger or foreigner, thus a guest. And we can see that as this word has changed over time, the spelling and the sounds have changed. The French word hospital comes from the Latin hospitalis, meaning hospitable, then which becomes the medieval Latin hospitale for shelter, the Old French hospitale for hospice, and the Middle English hospital for hospital. But during the Middle Ages, hospitals served different functions from modern institutions. Middle Ages hospitals were almshouses for the poor, hostels for pilgrims, or hospital schools. So the word hospital has come from our Latin hospitalis, meaning hospitable, which is derived from the Latin hospes, signifying a stranger or foreigner, thus a guest. And we can see that as this word has changed over time, the spelling and the sounds have changed. The hospitable, which is derived from the Latin hospes, signifying a stranger or foreigner, thus a guest. And we can see that as this word has changed over time, the spelling and the sounds have changed. So the word hospes for guest in Latin has developed into the ancient French Romance word hostel, which developed a silent S, so the letter is eventually removed from the word, signified by a circumflex in the modern French word hotel, and the German word Spittel shares similar roots. When we're looking at the words we have, it's not just that they've all developed and been passed down to us from earlier languages. Sometimes the words we have are from borrowings. So we can talk about cognates, where we've got words shared by related languages that have been descended from a word in an earlier language. But we can also talk about words that we've borrowed. So here, the word coffee, we've all borrowed from the Arabic kahwa. And for English, it's come from Arabic via Turkish and Danish. But here we have how the word ends up looking in all sorts of languages. So it's not that we all borrow words and they all look the same. We borrow them and adapt them according to the rules of our language. About words that we've borrowed. So here, the word coffee, we've all borrowed from the Arabic kahwa. And for English, it's come from Arabic via Turkish and Danish. But here we have how the word ends up looking in all sorts of languages. So it's not that we all borrow words and they all look the same. We borrow them and adapt them according to the rules of our language. So it's not that we all borrow words and they all look the same. We borrow them and adapt them according to the rules of our language. So we have Turkish, we have Greek, Thai, French, Bengali, Arabic, Danish, Swedish, German, Indonesian, Russian. And the important thing to note here is that everybody borrows words slightly differently according to the rules of their language. But it's not that we borrow things randomly, there are rules. So the th sound that we do have in English is borrowed into German as a s, but into Dutch as a t. And we've borrowed lots of words into English. We've borrowed algebra, zenith, zero, alcohol, alchemy from Arabic, jungle, shampoo, bungalow, loot, pajamas and thug from Hindi, volcano, violin, balcony, torso and studio from Italian, and potato, chocolate, cigar, sombrero and alligator from Spanish. And sometimes, if they're borrowed long ago enough, borrowed words can come completely nativized and we wouldn't know that they were borrowed. Words such as parent from Latin in the 14th century, not to mention the Middle English borrowings from Scandinavian, such as anger, cake, husband, window, seat, ugly and sky. But some borrowings can still remain very marked, so cafe and naive, we're aware aren't necessarily quite as Englishy English as anger, cake, husband, window, seat, ugly and sky. So let's see how English has changed. We've got a fascinating sentence here from Old English, which sounds roughly like this. Herr Alfred Koning gevierd with Eyalne Hera and Hinige Flinde. What do we think this means? I suspect for all of you this isn't particularly intelligible right now. Well, what it means is here King Alfred fought against the whole army and put it to flight. Ta-da! But how do we get there? It's not that, people went to sleep one day saying Herr Alfred Koning and woke up the next saying Here King Alfred. Rather, there is a whole succession of small changes that we can pinpoint and predict that have taken us from Old English to modern English. So what kinds of changes might we be talking about? Well, just as linguistics looks at the structure of languages today, looking at their sound structures, the word structure, the meaning of the words, the role of context, how phrases and sentences are structured, and the rules of longer interactions, we also look at how all of these aspects of structure vary and how they've changed over time. And this example here is a great way to see how many of these areas have changed. So let's take a brief sojourn into the historical development of all of these things. So if we're talking about English, often we'll denote Old English as the period from about 450 to 1150 AD. But of course, lots of scholars sort of debate exactly at what point we will say this is the start of Old English. So if we're thinking about bits of literature, we've got Caedmon's Hymn in the 660s and Beowulf in the 700s. Then from around 1150, we've got Middle English and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And then often we do note Modern English from around 1500. So this would include the work of Shakespeare. But some scholars separate Modern English into 1500 to 1800 and 1800 to present. And if any of you have attempted to read any of these works of literature, you'll note that Shakespeare, yes, there are things that are unfamiliar, but it's certainly more accessible today than the Canterbury Tales or Beowulf. So how did English develop? Well, before the 5th century, we had the Celts living in England. But then in the 5th century, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes from Northern Europe invaded, and they spoke a West Germanic language. And this developed into the earliest forms of English. And in the 6th to 8th centuries, we had a conversion to Christianity, which increased the Latin influence. And furthermore, we had in the 5th and 6th centuries, the runic alphabet was then taken over by the Roman alphabet, and we had increasing borrowings from Latin. And in the 8th and 9th centuries, the Vikings invaded, so we had increasing influence of Old Norse on our Old English. Then we can talk about Middle English. So we can, you'll note that the Norman invasion is happening about 1066, Battle of Hastings. And so what we're finding in Middle English is that our ruling class are using French. So our aristocracy, our clergy are speaking French, but the lay people are still using English. And that's why we have these pairs of words, cow, beef, pig, pork, sheep, mutton, calf, veal, deer, venison, where we have one word for the animal and another for its meat. One word for the people raising the animal and another for the people eating it. Subsequently, we have further influences on English during the colonial and imperial periods with new borrowings for all the things that are being brought back. So that's how we get the words curry, tea and pyjama from India. So let's take a closer look at our Old English example. Herr Alfred Koning gevierd with Eyalne Hera and Hinige Flinde. Here King Alfred fought against the whole army and put it to flight. So this is a sentence from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle written in Old English around 878 AD. So let's now break it down and see how we get from Herr Alfred Koning to here King Alfred. First things first, Koning has become king. So what we have here is a sound change. The U is becoming an E. Koning becomes king. Now this isn't a random change. What we have is a short U becomes an E if the following is a high front vowel or it's stressed. So this is what we call a conditioned sound change. and it's a sound change that's not just occurring in the word king, but occurred in all words where we have the same environment. This was then later complicated by the Great Vowel Shift. So this is happening around the 15th century. And unlike our change from U to E, which is a conditioned sound change that happens in a particular environment, the Great Vowel Shift is an unconditioned sound change where it's affecting all of these sounds regardless of the environment. So what we're having here is our long vowels are changing. So if we've got a long vowel that's already high, like U in E, where our tongue is very close to the roof of our mouth, this becomes a diphthong, I and ow. Whereas if the vowel is a bit lower than U and E, it steps up one, the tongue moves a bit higher. So we go from R to A and moving up. So that's how we get from hoose to house to house to house, slowly over time. We've got other changes in this sentence. Geviert. So here we have a morphological change. So if you sort of cut off the ge at the front, viert looks much more similar to fort. So we have an Old English prefix, ge, which is denoting completion of an action. So it's not just that he, fought against the army, he finished fighting against the army. In Middle English, this prefix ge becomes u, and eventually u isn't used anymore. So we've had this morphological change in our word structure. We've also got syntactic changes. So Kinga vlinder, eat flight. Now we've switched around the order of the words here. So in Old English, we would have the pronoun, that's the object of our verb, and then the verb, whereas now we have the verb and then the pronoun. We've also got lexical changes. So the word here for army is now obsolete. The last attested evidence we have for this is in 1508 with Arthur's here, Arthur's army. And this has been replaced by army from the Old French armée, which is first attested in 1425. And, I mentioned earlier that what we often find in Middle English is this division between the people speaking more French and the people speaking more English, at which point the balance of words that you'll have now in English reflect the priorities of the people most likely to use them. So if it is our military, our clergy, our noblemen who are perhaps most likely to refer to the army, that's part of why this word has superseded the now obsolete here. We've also got semantic changes. So it's not just that we're replacing some of our words, we're changing what some of them mean. So we can talk about the semantic change of the word with, which used to mean against, but now means with. But note, we still have the phrase fought with that denotes being in a fight, fighting against someone. In semantic change, we can often refer to sort of two patterns. We can talk about extensions, where the meaning of a word extends to cover new reference. So the Old English dogga, which referred to a specific breed of dog, has come to mean any dog. But we can also talk about reductions, where the meaning is narrowed to refer to fewer things. So the Old English hund meant any dog, but now refers to a specific type of dog. And those of you who speak any German will note that the German hund has kept this sense of any dog. We've got a similar pattern with the word deer, which meant any animal, but then the word animal came in from French to mean any animal, so deer became to refer to a specific type of animal, whereas in German, Tier still means this any kind of animal. But language is still changing. It's not that we've got to modern English and we're done. Language change is ceaseless and remorseless. Every language that is spoken continues to change, not just century by century, but day by day. The language that you speak is not just different from your parents' language, it's different from the language you were speaking last year or last week, even if you don't notice the changes occurring on such a small time scale. And language is still changing. Over the past few decades, 3 new ways of reporting speech have appeared. Instead of going, so Layla said, where I wish I'd been here, We can say, so Layla goes, so Layla is like, so Layla is all. And I'm sure that for some of you, there are nuances in these different ways of reporting speech, but there aren't for me, and there probably aren't for your parents. And this is still changing. It's part of why your parents keep complaining about your language, because it is different to what they grew up with. But sometimes language change can lead to language death. So with English, we've talked about the influences coming in from other languages, but we can also get cases where we have a multilingual society, where we have two languages in contact, and slowly there becomes a preference for one language over the other. We have a language shift. And then if no one is learning this language anymore as a child, the language becomes moribund. And then when we have no living speakers, we say the language has died. So why might this happen? Well, it's all to do with the attitudes that we have towards our language. So let's take the case of Garifuna. This is an Arawakan language. It's spoken in Honduras, Belize, and other Central American countries. And its total speakers are around 100,000, but of course, different people will count this differently. So let's take a closer look at Garifuna spoken in Belize. In Belize, you've got a language choice. You can speak Garifuna, or you can speak Belizean Creole, which is related to English. When you speak Garifuna, this often signifies that you're identifying with a particular ethnic group, whereas with Belizean Creole, it signifies that you're identifying as Belizean rather than with a more specific group. And there are generational differences about what this identification means. So for children, they view speaking Garifuna as a mark of shame. It's marking them as poor and backward to identify so closely with this ethnic group. Whereas for their parents, speaking Garifuna is a sign of pride in who you are in identifying with this group. So this change in attitudes over time will likely result in more and more people prioritising speaking Belizean Creole, and over time Garifuna will become moribund and die. And this isn't, just unique to the case of Garifuna. There are lots of American Indian languages that are dying out. There's languages all over the world that are dying out. And there are some attempts to revitalise these languages. But it can be very difficult depending on what resources you have available. We're not just interested in English. Yes, today we've spoken a lot about the changes that we find in English because that can be very accessible. But as linguists, we're interested in all the languages of the world and how they change and how they're structured. So we can think about Semitic sound changes. So by Semitic languages, we're thinking languages like Arabic, Hebrew, and in a parent language, Proto-Canaanite, we had a sound change where R becomes an O. Now, the parent of Arabic didn't undergo this sound change, so this long R has persisted in Salam. But Iberian Hebrew is descended from Proto-Canaanite. So here we do see the evidence of that sound change, and that's how we get Shalom instead. We've also got sound changes in Welsh. So the R has become an A. This penultimate syllable vowel has raised or become further to the front of the mouth if it is before an ending that's an E or a Y. So Bardi has become Berth, meaning bards. And you'll notice that this is actually a really similar sound change to what we had with Kuning becoming king. We've got this, very common process in many ways, that our vowels, our tongue will just move up a bit if there's a sound where it needs to be further up coming. So thank you very much for listening today. I hope that you have enjoyed this presentation and have got a better sense about what linguistics is and what we're interested in. And I sincerely hope that you decide to study linguistics at some point. But in any case, I hope this has given you a greater understanding and appreciation for this amazing thing that we all do all the time. So thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.